Hey guys, it's Justin Bradley here. Figured I'd just do a quick overview of how to bottle. On the last video we ended up doing the Saison, and that ended up being a great beer to bottle condition. I actually like to give it a few months in there. So I started out, of course, with washing the bottles. You got to be able to get all the crud out of there, so I like to use, you can use a PBW, or I actually like the OxyClean, but it's got to be the OxyClean that doesn't have any of the perfumes or dyes or anything like that in there. It also doesn't have any chlorine in there. So that'll help, you know, get all of the proteins broken down in there, but it doesn't actually sanitize anything. So then I usually fill up a basin with some Star San here, usually about a half an ounce of that with 2 gallons of water in there. It does the trick pretty well. And so I will soak all the bottles in there to get them sanitized. Great thing with Star San is that you actually leave it behind, like you don't have to sit there and rinse it out. So you leave that residue and any foam in there is fine. You just take the whole bottle, you flip it over, set it in one of these little bottle holders. They're great. They keep everything off the ground. And that residue will help protect it. These bottle holders are great also because dust tends to fall downward, and so once they're upside down like this, they're pretty good about staying clean. You're not going to have a lot of things that are flying up inside them. So I've got the bottles all cleaned up. Some of them were reused bottles from before that I had to really scrub with the OxyClean to make sure there's nothing behind, and some of them were brand new, so I could really just soak those in the sanitizer and be fine. So the next step is going to be getting the bucket of these the Saison out, and then I'm also going to start boiling up some sugar water to be able to help prime the yeast that's alive in that bucket. So I'll show you what we're going to do with that. We're going to move it from one bucket over to the other so we don't have it all over that big yeast cake, and then we'll make that sugar solution here in just a minute. Alright, so it's time to rack the Saison off out of its original bucket. So we're going to try and put it in a nice clean bucket so that it gets off of that big yeast cake. What I've done here is I've actually filled up the racking cane, which was nice and sterilized. I filled it up with regular water. It's just filtered water right now. There's several ways of doing that. I mean, you can get one of the fancy siphoning tubes. Some of those actually have a lot of nooks and crannies for bacteria and stuff to get into, so they kind of worry me. A lot of times I'll just take the clean water and I'll just suck it right through the tube, and then I'll actually take the end here that I had on my mouth, and I can get it clean in my nice Sani solution down there. So it's pretty clean. I'm not terribly worried about this. You can get more elaborate systems if you want. So then all we're going to end up doing is we'll take the lid off of the Saison here, kind of set that aside, and then we'll put the end in there, and gravity should feed the liquid right on down into the bucket. So let's just bring that on up here. There we go, and we can see that it started quickly pulling the beer right through. So, and there's probably about 1.5 ounces of filtered water that made its way into there, but I'm not terribly worried about that. It's not going to be enough to oxidize it or anything like that. And there's still plenty of living yeast in here that they're going to be scrubbing any oxygen anyway, because we're going to actually be adding some sugary solution here in a minute, and that'll have some oxygen of its own too. So not too worried about that. So now that this is going, we might as well get that sugary solution going that's going to be used to prime the bottles. Alright, so we're going to make that priming solution right now. It's just going to be sugar and water. I usually use just table sugar. Some people will use dextrose, so that's corn sugar. Use different amounts when you're using the two of them. With table sugar, here's where it becomes kind of an art, is that with exactly 5 gallons of something like a pale ale, kind of right in the middle of the amount of carbonation that we would want, you would use 2/3 of a cup of sugar. So when you first open up your bucket, you want to see how much you have in there. Do you really have a full 5 gallons, or are you looking at 4 gallons in there? If you are, then of course try and reduce it by about 20%. Also, are you going to do a style that you want it to be really well carbonated, like a Saison actually? I would say you'd want that kind of be a little more carbonated than normal. Or do you want it to be something a little more like an English ESB or something like that, where you might actually tone that down to half as much priming sugar, because you really don't want that thing to be super fizzy. So there's a little bit of art there. Just know what you want before you end up making the solution here. So I'm just going to start out with 2/3 of a cup because I think we've got about 4.5 gallons of that Saison. So at 2/3 of a cup, we'll end up right where we want it to be. Alright, so we're getting towards the bottom of the bucket here. You can see that we've still got quite a bit of beer in there. We're going to start really starting to suck up a whole lot of the yeast. So I like to give it a little tilt like this. This should just be a mild tilt. You don't want to stir too much up. But you can see that nice yeast cake at the bottom. It'll pretty much stay on one side. So I just do that for the last, 30 seconds or a minute. You don't have to be too greedy about trying to get every last drop if it's going to mean that you're going to suck up a bunch of crud in there. So I usually stop right around maybe there. That's plenty. And I'll leave all that behind. We'll end up doing another episode on here where we kind of see how to be able to reuse that yeast that's in there, because that is the best yeast. It's super vibrant. It's ready to take off right now if we were to throw it into something. So we're not going to do that with this. We don't really have another Saison coming right behind this. So we'll just end up cleaning this one out. But that's what I like to do at the end. And right now we're still boiling that sugary water. We're going to give it another 5 minutes or so until we're ready to add it into the wort and start bottling. Alright, so we're about to add that sugary solution to the Saison. This line right here inside of the bucket, that's actually the 5-gallon line. So we did end up at about 4 and maybe 1/4 gallon. And so it was a little lower than we had wanted. There was a lot of yeast in there and I didn't want to suck up too much of that stuff. So there was a little bit of loss there. So this is the 2/3 of a cup. This is what I would use on the regular pale ale or something like that. I would say I would have amped it up a little bit for a Saison, but I probably don't want to do this whole thing for the Saison right now if it's only 4 gallons. So I'm actually going to hold back a little bit of it as I'm pouring it out. Probably like a, 1/3 of a cup. So it'll just be basically a couple tablespoons worth of the sugar that won't end up in there, just because I don't want these things to turn into gushers. I like a nice carbonated Saison, but over the top it can just get messy. So I'm just going to add this in there. I've already re-sanitized this tubing here. Just going to pour that in and just leave a bit behind. Give it a little light stir. Don't have to do much because you're going to add a whole lot of oxygen to it if you get real vigorous here. So just a light stir. I let it cool just a little bit. I gave it about 5 minutes outside of boiling to let it cool a smidge, but you don't have to let it get very cool. The amount of liquid that you're pouring in there, no matter how hot it is probably not going to adjust the temperature of that full thing of liquid by more than 1/4 degree. So don't worry about like leaving it in the fridge for a long time, because what you'll inherently do is you'll end up putting it in the fridge and you'll forget about it, and then you'll end up bottling all your beer, and then you'll go back to the fridge later on to grab a beer and you'll see you'll have this pot of sugary water in there, and that really sucks. I like to just get after it as fast as possible so I don't forget. So now it's going to be time to lift the bucket up to here. We'll set all the bottles down below because once again it'll be gravity fed, and we'll start filling up the bottles. Alright, so now the most tedious part of this process. We've already got the line filled up with beer just like we did before. Once again, you can siphon with your mouth, you can use water to be able to get started, something like that. Just make sure everything's cleaned up afterward. Dip it in Sandy if you have to. The only difference here is that on the end of this we have one of those little bottling tips, and if you go on Amazon you can find one of those, or if you go to your Homebrew store, but they just have this little button on it that is spring loaded that won't allow beer to come through unless you're pushing on the bottom of the bottle. So that means that you can kind of take your time getting ready. Also, if you have to run around and do something, you can just leave it there and it'll stop. So I like to, on the first bottle or two, just use something kind of ugly that I'm going to remember. So I've got these ugly bottles right here with these flip tops. But I'll always remember which ones were the first one, and the reason is you tend to get a little bit of stuff, even though we tried not to get a whole lot of yeast and trub and stuff like that into this bottling bucket, it still happens. You'll still get a little bit in there, and it tends to settle to the bottom, and so that first bottle or two can have a little more yeast to it, or a little more trub to it or whatever. It tends to not be exactly the same as all the rest of them. And if you're into competition brewing, you don't want to wonder which bottle was the one that you messed around on and end up having that be the one that go to the judges. So if instead you have a couple of bottles that you always remember are kind of the ugly guys that at least you can try it after 3 weeks for your first tasting, then that's a good way to go about this. So I always do it in this one, and all you have to do is start pressing down, and the beer will start to flow into there. We're going to end up filling it as far up as we can, and that seems like, oh man, you're overfilling it, there's not going to be a gap, but you got to remember there's a lot of space that's taken up by the tubing. So once I actually pull that tubing out, I mean it was all the way up there, but now once I pull the tubing out, it drops it all the way down to there, and that's actually a perfect place to be. Also, have that next bottle sitting there and ready for you. Don't like move it all the way from one bottle to another, because your wife or girlfriend will kick your butt when they find these stains of beer all over the place. So if instead you've got the next one ready, you just drop it right on into there, start pressing it down, and you can get yourself a good little kind of conveyor belt system here, assembly line going. Always have 2 or 3 of those next bottles ready. I don't cap them immediately just because that would mean I'd have to stop, cap it, come back, do this, stop, cap it. If you're really obsessive about the amount of oxygen that might be touching the beer, you can do that way. I just find that I can so quickly go bam, 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 bam through all the bottles and then just start cranking out the bottle caps all at the end instead of having to stop and go back and forth. So it's up to you. See, now there, the spring was actually being pushed just lightly enough that it kept allowing the beer to come up. So I caught it right as it hit the edge. But this is why I always bring a paper towel when I'm about to sit down, so that I don't have to scurry around for it later, is that just in case there might have been, yep, there's a couple drops went over the edge. So I've already got a little paper towel. I'm ready to drop that down, clean it right up, no big deal. We can move right along, but I've definitely done it before and had to jump up and find a towel and all that stuff, which is just a pain. So always bring a paper towel with you. I also like to already have my bottle caps with me. As you can see, they're sitting here in sanitizing solution, and then I've already got my bottle capper here, so it's already ready to go, so I don't have to run around afterward. I can just start capping it right away. So I've probably got about 30 of these to fill up, so I'm not going to torture you with watching that, but we'll come back when it comes time to actually cap these guys. Alright, so we're now capping the bottles. They've all been filled up with about 1.5 inches worth of headspace, so that's the distance between the cap and the actual beer. You want that amount of space because that will allow it to get carbonated as much as we want. If you did less space than that, it tends to undercarbonate. There's just not enough room in the gas space for it to be able to have room to consume all those sugars. And then if you have too much, you tend to overcarbonate it. So 1.5 inches is great. All I do is right away I set all the caps on top. Instead of trying to crank one at a time, because then you're getting your hands wet in the sanitizing solution, you're cranking it, then you're getting your hands wet and you're flinging sanitizer all over the place. So it's better to just do all these at once. Once you've got them on there, you just set that on there. There's a lot of different types of bottle cappers, but most of them are about the same style. It's some sort of this where you're going to put the cap right in the middle and you just crank it down like that, and that's going to seal it off. So you'll start kind of an assembly line once again where you're just grabbing all these that are they already have a cap on top of them, crank through it, grab the next, crank through it. It's nice to have your box ready, so I've actually got my box that all the bottles came in. So I'll actually set that next to me, and then as I'm bottling, I might as well just start dropping them right in there. So yep, I'll get cranking through all of these, and then we'll talk about kind of temperatures and what the cellaring will be like in just a minute. Alright, so we're done capping all those bottles. As you can see, they're now in the boxes and ready to put into nice cellar conditions to be able to bottle condition those. You're going to want to keep in mind what type of beer that you have in there when it comes to the temperature that you're conditioning these in. If it's something that you really want to be able to age for quite a while, you're going to want it to be fairly cool, keep it really dark. If it's something like a Saison though, I mean, we'll probably let this condition at maybe 73, 74 degrees. because we actually don't mind getting some of those cool Belgian characteristics out of it. But if I were doing like a real bright IPA or pale ale, I'd probably keep it down at around 64, 65 degrees. And then once 3 weeks was over, I would get it immediately into a refrigerator so that you didn't get rid of any of those nice hops that you paid all that extra money for. But this we can actually leave at 72, 73 degrees for months and it'll do great. Seems like right around 5 or 6 months is when it's actually at its best. So I'm going to go put it in our closet, nice dark area, should keep that temperature really steady, and then I'll come back and try it in probably about 5 weeks to see how it's turning out. So thanks for listening. This is how I like to bottle. Like I've been saying throughout, there's a lot of different variations to equipment that you can get. There is a little bit of art to how much carbonation you're trying to get out of it, but don't worry too much. Your first couple times that you bottle, it's really not that big of a deal. It's a little tedious, and I would recommend it as soon as you can get a keg. Definitely get a kegging system. But for now, this will lead you on your way to some good beer. So just keep brewing. It gets better all the time. Now, when it comes to cellaring for bottle conditioning, just make sure you understand you're going to have to go, Porter. You got to go somewhere else. You got to go in another room. Go in the other room.
Come on, Brew Dog. Come on.